good evening. My name is Bill Barabalt. I'm president of the Richard Nixon Foundation, and it's a proud moment to see all of you here this evening. Thank you for coming. Foundation has enjoyed putting together a number of programs for this year, and as we continue the balance of the year, we have got Ann Romney, Newt Gingrich, Greg Gutfeld from Fox, Secretary Henry Paulson, and others that I think will be an exciting program as we finish 2015. It's also a very exciting time for the library. Many of you know that we're approaching a period of renovation, and I thought I'd share that with you. At the end of this month, the library's museum section itself will be closed for nearly a year to bring new technology and new displays to reach out to an entirely new generation of young people. We're very excited. That's only half of our efforts, though. Right now, the foundation is in the process of transforming its programming into a robust historical education center within the next year. We're going to implement new civic and leadership educational programs for students and forge much closer relationships with the universities around us. We have a special guest this evening that's going to introduce our honored guests. Dr. Donald Vinson is a good friend of the foundation and a longtime friend of our chairman, Ron Walker. He's chairman of Vinson & Company, a behavioral science consulting firm, and is a member of the executive committee of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Before that, he was a diplomat and representative of the United States abroad under Presidents George H. Bush and Bill Clinton, and served as the California Commissioner of Judicial Performance under our good friend and foundation board member, Governor Pete Wilson. Dr. Vinson also has a distinguished career in academia, having headed the marketing department at USC and as a professor at UCLA. And I did ask him how he handled that conflict, and we'll let him address that. He's written over 10 books and is an expert on juror behavior, trial strategies, and behavioral psychology. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Vinson.
Thank you, Bill. That was very generous, and I must say, on the faculty at both USC and UCLA, psychologists refer to someone like me as suffering approach conflict. What side of the stadium do you sit on during the big game? Well, I haven't figured that out yet, but it is my deep privilege and pleasure to introduce tonight's guest speaker and honored speaker tonight, and his daughter, Liz. You know, it's fascinating for someone like Dick Cheney, who has spent the majority of his adult life in service to this country. He's a man who exemplifies leadership qualities of wisdom, judgment, and intense courage. His wisdom and judgment have been reflected by the basis of 4 presidents of the United States seeking his counsel and his advice, and 1 president asking him to be the Vice President of the United States. Dick Cheney's courage, I think, is exemplified today by his willingness to speak out on issues that are important to me, and I think important to everyone in this room. His voice, to me, is an amplification of the values, the attitudes, the beliefs that I think many of us hold. Today in Washington, D.C., there seem to be some who want to apologize for our traditions, our culture, our heritage, who are embarrassed by the exceptional status that this country has achieved in the world during its very short history. If you're like me, I think that this book is going to speak to us just as our 2 speakers tonight are about to speak to us, and I think we're going to share their views, and I think you're going to enjoy them. So it is now my privilege, my pleasure, to introduce the Vice President of the United States and Liz Cheney. Mr. Vice President.
you, Don, for that wonderful introduction, wherever you've gone. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be back here again at the Nixon Library. It's becoming sort of a family tradition. My dad and I were here in 2011 when we came to discuss his memoirs, and I think more recently you were here with Mom to discuss her book about James Madison. But it's a wonderful place that provides a tremendous service to those of us who care deeply about American history. And it's in that spirit, really, that my dad and I decided to write this book. The British historian Andrew Roberts once said, in response to the question whether America was born great, achieved greatness, or had greatness thrust upon her, the only possible answer must be all three. That we were born of the really revolutionary ideal that we're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and we became really at our birth a model for the rest of the world. And then through the fire of World War II, we became freedom's defender, and at the end of the Cold War, we became the world's sole superpower. And when you look back on this history, what you see clearly, and one of the things that we felt was so important as we progressed in this project, was to talk about the truth of American history. And what you see is that victory in World War II and victory in the Cold War and the success we had in the dawn of the Age of Terror didn't come about just because of America's involvement in world events, but those things came about very much because of America's leadership in world events. We felt that as we enter this election season, we wanted to make sure that these issues were sort of clearly at the forefront of voters' minds as they cast their votes. And both of us certainly were very driven by what we were hearing from my kids, in my dad's case, his grandkids, as they came home from school and talked about the lessons they were learning about American history. And too often, they were learning lessons that would lead you to believe America has been a malign power in the world, that we've had a negative impact and a negative influence. And we felt very strongly that that's shameful, that our kids need to understand the truth about this nation and who we are and what we've done. And what we thought we might do tonight is I'm going to interview my dad, talk to him about different parts of the book, and then we'd like to read some sections, short sections of the book to you. But I wanted to begin tonight by talking about the historical context. Don mentioned that there have been 5 Republican presidents, or of the last 5 Republican presidents, you worked for 4 of them, advised the 5th closely. And given sort of the breadth of your experience and what you've seen in national security policy over the last 4 decades, really, assess where we are today as a nation. Assess sort of the threats and our capability to confront those threats in the context of your experience and where we've been before and the threats we've faced previously.
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here today. It's always fun to come back to the Nixon Library. As many of you know, that's how I started my political career in Washington, was working in the Nixon administration beginning in May of '69. And so still got a lot of good friends from that era. A lot of us get together in November of every year and relive the good old days. But it's always a pleasure, a special pleasure to come back here. I can't sit here without thinking about the East Room of the White House. And because, of course, that's what it was built to be. But you're transported right back to that set of circumstances. The situation that partly led us to write this book was we became very, very concerned over a couple of propositions. One, that the whole issue of national security didn't receive the kind of attention we thought it required in the last election. That it wasn't front and center, and yet there were all kinds of things going on in the world that indicated to us, at least, that thought it should be. We also, as we looked at the world, saw rising threats in certain places around the world. You talk about the rise of ISIS in the Middle East, China increasingly aggressive in the South China Sea and in Asia, Vladimir Putin in Russia, moving against, first of all, taking Crimea and then moving against Ukraine. And as we were faced what appeared to us to be increasing threats to our security and the security of our friends and allies, our ability to deal with those threats was being diminished because of the policies of the Obama administration. We saw rapid and dramatic reductions in the defense budget, withdrawal from certain key parts of the world. The president voiced an ideology or philosophy that he believes in, but that we think is fundamentally at odds with the way many Americans think, certainly we do, and that if I go back and look at it from a historical standpoint, and go back over the last 75 years, really since the beginning of World War II, I think there's been a bipartisan consensus. Not perfect, mind you. There clearly have been party differences from time to time on various issues, but that as a general proposition, starting with Roosevelt in World War II, and Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, Jack Kennedy, Dick Nixon, Ronald Reagan, the Bushes, a general sense that the world works best when the United States provides leadership, that meant we had to play a significant role in the world, that meant we needed first-class military in order to be able to influence events the way that needed to be influenced. But that this administration, the Obama administration, now after more than 6 years in office, President Obama doesn't share that consensus. That he spent his early months after he got to be president traveling around the world on what we call the apology tour, apologizing for our actions after 9/11. Saying we overreacted to the killing of 3,000 Americans on 9/11. Of course, tomorrow will be the anniversary, the 14th anniversary of that dramatic day that all of us remember. But his basic view of the world was different than what we had seen from presidents, Democrat and Republican alike, over most of that 75-year period of time. And it gave us great concern, and we thought it was important to dig into some of those issues and draw comparisons, if you will, to those earlier days. We didn't mean to be partisan in the sense that you can't read our book without coming away with a certain amount of increased respect for Roosevelt and Truman and the way they dealt with World War II and the Cold War. So we didn't set out to write a Republican or a Democratic book, although it is clearly critical of the current administration. But that's primarily because of what we think is a fundamental deviation, if you will, from the traditional consensus by this administration on national security issues.
We start the book in World War II, and I wonder if you could talk about sort of comparing the situation that General Marshall, for example, faced when he came into office in 1939 in terms of the state of the military, and whether you see similarities, differences, and what lessons we can take from what he was able to do and undertook and some of the challenges we face today.
Well, of course, Marshall became the Chief of Staff of the Army and became the #1 military officer the same day the Germans invaded Poland in September 1939. At the time, the United States Army, I believe, was the 17th in the world in terms of size. Romania had a bigger army than we did. And the threats that represented, Marshall understood very well, and partly what we covered in the book. He did a masterful job working with and sometimes leading, if you will, President Roosevelt to a very aggressive posture in terms of rebuilding our military capabilities and mobilizing our defense industrial base to build the resources that were needed to prevail in World War II. We became the arsenal of democracy and raised that magnificent force that then went on to win the war in the Pacific and the war in Europe. It was a truly amazing proposition. But they were coming off a period where isolationism was very strong. There was a time when Gerald Ford, as a young lawyer out of law school in the late 1930s, was an America firster. He wasn't alone. He obviously went away to war, served with great honor in the Pacific on aircraft carrier, the USS Monterey. Came home after the war, committed to an international view in terms of the role the U.S. had to play in the world, and obviously that's the way he governed. But so it was a period of time that was similar to some extent, and that there was a certain strain of isolationism then. We find some of that now too, people frustrated obviously by the wars that we've had to fight in the last several years, the events of 9/11 and the aftermath in Afghanistan and Iraq. What it took then to mobilize the nation to get ready to go to war, especially in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, was leadership. A strong understanding and worldview, and Roosevelt and Truman both provided that. That's what it's going to take again, is leadership in order to reverse course on the circumstances we find now, where the United States position, instead of being as strong as we were, especially after the Cold War victory, Ronald Reagan's president, the Soviet Union broke up, the Berlin Wall came down, and there was no question about who the dominant power in the world was, and that was the United States. And today we're in a situation where we've got an administration that steers a different course, leads from behind, doesn't believe in the U.S. playing a major role in the world the way our predecessors did.
One of the issues on which you've been criticized, and people find it hard to believe that you've been criticized, I know, but it happens every now and then.
Maybe it's because of the Darth Vader emblem I keep on the back of my pickup truck.
Very proud of that. Is the Iraq War. And in particular, and I want to talk about Iran in a second, so don't jump ahead, but when you made a speech on Tuesday morning at the American Enterprise Institute laying out a pretty devastating critique of the Iran deal, the White House response was to put a video up criticizing you about Iraq. Now, my own personal view is that, you know, the president who referred to ISIS as the JV team is not in a great position to be criticizing anybody about Iraq. But talk a little bit about Iraq and talk about it in the context of the war on terror, why you did it, and what your sense is of those decisions today.
Well, I think everybody remembers, especially with the display out here on the war on terror. I just had a chance to look at it for a few minutes, but it's really remarkable. But in 1990, when I was Secretary of Defense, you may remember, of course, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and that first weekend, President Bush sent me out, this is President Bush 41, sent me out to begin to organize and get authorization and approval from the Egyptians and the Saudis and so forth to deploy forces. And we ultimately deployed more than 500,000 men and women to the Gulf, basically, for the first Gulf War, Desert Storm. Iraq was the focal point at that time, and we set about, did accomplish our mission in relatively short order. And people often ask, well, why didn't you go all the way to Baghdad the first time you were there? And the answer was that that wasn't our mission. Secondly, that nobody was really pushing it. It wasn't an option that anybody was enamored of at the time. Our mission was to defeat Saddam Hussein and push him out of Kuwait, liberate Kuwait. That's what Congress had signed up to. That's what the 30-some nations had signed on to support the effort would have signed up to, the United Nations and so forth. They asked then what was different 12 years later in 2003. Well, huge difference was in between we'd had 9/11. And we'd gone from a situation in which terrorist attacks basically were law enforcement problems. If you had an attack on the embassy in East Africa, the FBI would get into the business, and they'd go out and try to round up the guilty parties. And if we caught them, we'd bring them back and subject them to trial. 9/11 was different, dramatically different. 9/11 was an act of war. 9/11 was a time when we lost 3,000 of our people, more than we lost at Pearl Harbor. World Trade Center destroyed. The Pentagon had a big hole in it. We would have lost the White House or the Capitol building if it hadn't been for the folks on United 93 that day. And in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, we were concerned about the possibility of another attack, another mass casualty attack. But the next time around, we might find the attackers armed with something far deadlier, than airline tickets and box cutters, which is all the 19 hijackers had when they took down those aircraft in the time of 9/11. So we were in a situation where we had a lot of intelligence that indicated that Iraq was in fact a major source of problems, not in terms of having been directly involved in the attack of 9/11, but a long history of violation of UN Security Council resolutions, a long history with weapons of mass destruction. There was never any doubt that they had a nuclear program back in '81 when the Israelis took it out. They had another one that I was briefed on by our Israeli friends in the summer of '90, shortly before Saddam invaded Kuwait. They'd restarted their nuclear program that the Israelis had destroyed 10 years before. So Saddam had a well-established track record as having relationship with terrorists and refusal to honor the UN Security Council pledges that were there. And he was deemed to be the locale where we might see this connection between, on the one hand, terrorists like Al-Qaeda, and on the other hand, weapons of mass destruction, such as he'd used for years against the Iranians and against his own people, and had twice previously built nuclear programs. So that's what really motivated our thinking as we decided what we were going to do to deal with the problems in the aftermath of 9/11 and try to anticipate the future problems we would have. That had a lot to do with why we focused in '03 on going after Saddam Hussein directly. I think it was the right thing to do. It's still controversial. I always point to what followed after that. After we took down Saddam Hussein, arrested him in December of '03, Muammar Gaddafi got religion. He saw what we did to Saddam, and he decided he didn't want to have the same thing happen to him. So he announced 5 days after we captured Hussein, he announced he was turning over all of his nuclear materials to the U.S. And at the time, he had centrifuges, he had uranium feedstock, he had weapons design. He was in the business of trying to build his own nuclear capability, and he turned all of it over to us. We have it today. It's here in the United States. That was important for a couple of reasons. One, because remember now just a few years ago, Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown. ISIS was involved, and other radical terrorist organizations. Imagine how much trouble we'd have today if there had in fact been a nuclear program in place when ISIS took over and toppled Gaddafi's government. We'd have been in a world of hurt. Didn't happen because of his fear of our military power. We also had a situation in which taking down Gaddafi led us to Mr. A.Q. Khan. Khan was the architect that built the Pakistani program, and he'd gotten into the business, black market business of doing business, not only with Libya, they were his best customer, but with the Iranians, the North Koreans, and others. And so we ended up shutting down Khan's black market operation. He'd been the ones that had first provided centrifuge technology to the Iranians in a hotel in Dubai back in 1987. So the fallout, if you will, the consequences of our military action against Iraq included not only those things, but also it's the only time the Iranians halted their nuclear program was when we went in and took down Saddam Hussein, because they were fearful, again, that we might be next. So I thought it was very important to do. I think it was those who argue that we should not have gone in '03 have to also explain what would have happened in those other circumstances with respect to the proliferation of nuclear weapons, or what the world would look like if we'd left Saddam Hussein in power and he had gone back to his earlier practices of building and using weapons of mass destruction. So I think it was very important for us, and as I say, I've always been a staunch supporter of that decision.
Let's talk. Let's talk about what we see happening in Iraq and Syria today, with the hundreds of thousands of refugees we now see rushing into Europe to escape ISIS and the caliphate. What's your sense of what the next president will have to do, and whether those who argue that ISIS can somehow be contained have a point to make?
Well, I think if anybody's watched ISIS operate, this is maybe the bloodiest minded crew I've ever seen in terms of the way they function, what they believe, the way they govern under Sharia law. You just look at hundreds of thousands of people fleeing Syria right now this summer, up through through Turkey and then on up into Europe. That's a direct reflection, I think, of the fact that the U.S. is no longer has much of a presence in that part of the world. I think it's a reaction to the fact that ISIS emerged after Barack Obama withdrew all U.S. forces from Iraq. And we ended up with a vacuum, and it's been filled by ISIS. And ISIS is partly an evolution from Al-Qaeda, partly a whole new group, deadlier than Al-Qaeda. And they've now created a caliphate. First time we've had one of those in hundreds of years, a caliphate where both parts of Iraq and part of Syria are under ISIS control. And they've created circumstances that are so dire that we've got literally thousands of people fleeing out of that space now up into Europe. What has to be done, I think the only possible answer has to be we have to defeat ISIS. This notion that somehow we can contain them doesn't work. It doesn't work partly because there is this massive overflow now of people out of the region that they control and govern, and that will continue. There's the real danger, I think, of the proliferation of nuclear weapons. We saw back in 2007 when I was in the White House, I was visited one day by Meir Dagan, came and saw me. He was head of the Israeli Mossad, and Steve Hadley was with me. And he laid down for us color photographs taken inside the North Korean-built nuclear reactor at Al-Kabar in Syria. Why is that significant? Well, all of a sudden Bashar Assad had a nuclear reactor. He didn't put it out there because he needed power. He put it out there because he had nuclear aspirations. And the area where they built it is the area that's now controlled by ISIS. Another set of circumstances where if the Israelis hadn't taken it out, which they did in the fall of 2007, we'd be in a situation again where you could have ISIS potentially acquiring nuclear capability because of what they would have inherited from Syria. So I think we have to be very tough and aggressive going forward. I think ultimately the only solution, the lasting solution, is the destruction of ISIS. We've got to work a lot with the people in the region, with friends, especially in the Sunni community, the Saudis, the Egyptians, Jordanians, the Emirates, and others, and as well as obviously with Israel too, to in fact destroy ISIS. That's the only ultimate solution.
We talk in the book about the Pentagon and about the defense budget. And we have a series of recommendations for the next president, and the first one has to do with defense spending. Given what's happened in terms of the spending by the federal government, the massive explosion in spending that you've seen under the Obama administration, and the sense among many, including some in our own party, that you've got to cut wherever you can, how would you recommend the next president go about restoring the damage that's been done, restoring the defense budget, and convincing others to follow him or her?
Well, I'm not someone who is opposed to defense cuts automatically under the right circumstances. When I was secretary, we actually canceled. It was a program called the A-12. It was a stealth aircraft for the Navy, similar to the F-117 that was built for the Air Force. But I found after I got in that there were serious problems with the program. The contractors came in and wanted more time and more money, and we said no and shut it down. It was, at that time, and may still be, the biggest defense contract ever canceled. So I'm not opposed, nor was I when I was there on the A-12. But we're far beyond that point now. We're to a position where Ray Odierno, the Army Chief of Staff, just retired, great guy, tremendously capable general, said just a few weeks ago that the United States Army is now less ready than it's been at any time in its history. That's over 200 years. He's talking about basic fundamental readiness in the force, trained, equipped, ready to go tomorrow to perform whatever mission they need to perform, but that he can no longer do that. the Air Force Chief of Staff announcing that the inventory of aircraft today that the Air Force is flying is smaller and older than ever before in its history, going back to the end of World War II when we created the Air Force back in 47 and 48. It's a situation where the impact has been absolutely devastating, partly because of what's called the sequester. And the way you ought to build a defense budget is you ought to, working obviously with the President, National Security Staff, state, and so forth, identify the threats, put together your strategy, what it is you think you need in order to be able to defend against those threats, and then build a budget based on that planning that lets you acquire the force that you'll need to deal with any conceivable contingency. We don't do that anymore. Since the passage of the Budget Control Act of 2011, which is what now has been 4 or 5 years ago, we have a thing called the sequester. And what happens, it was adopted because it's such a crazy way to do business. From a budgeting standpoint, the assumption was Congress will never let this go into effect. They'll act and adopt a better process. Never happened. We're living with what was originally intended to be so bad that it was adopted only because they couldn't come up with anything else. But the sequester basically kicks in the 1st of October every year. It takes an across-the-board cut out of every spending category, but a lot of programs have been exempted from it. So while defense constitutes 17% of the federal budget, they take 50% of the cuts. And the consequence of that has been we're now to the point where I think all of the chiefs within the last year have testified before Congress that they're no longer confident they have the capacity with what they're receiving, that they have the capacity to execute the national strategy. Now, that's a terrible thing to say, but it's a direct result, partly of the Obama policy, because the president doesn't care much about the military. He's perfectly happy to see it cut because, and have those other programs exempted because he wants to spend the money on domestic matters. But it's reached the point where there are very, very serious shortages and shortfalls. If I were to argue what the number one priority ought to be for the next administration, the next president, it has to be rebuilding our military. We're far beyond the point where we can say, well, we've got to cut something, and so you whack away at defense. Defense has been taking the vast bulk of those cuts. It's done on an automatic basis, a meat-axe approach. It's a stupid way to budget. And we got to this point only because the administration and the Congress had not been able to come up with a more orderly, natural way to do business, and we're going to pay a terrible price. Next administration will have to take a long time before we can recover to all the damage that's already happened. You cannot build a military capability of the kind we've had in the past and the kind we're going to need in the future if you think you can just sort of write a check overnight and tomorrow there'll be a military. It doesn't work that way. I have one more quick story. One of the first things I did after Desert Storm, we had a great victory, the troops had performed magnificently. I called Ronald Reagan. He was in retirement out here in California, and I thanked him for all that he'd done when he was in office to build that magnificent force that we went to war with 10 years later in 1991 on Desert Storm. He's the guy who bought the F-15s and the Abrams tanks and the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. And we were blessed, I was, and those of us who served in the administration in those days, blessed with the fact that we followed Ronald Reagan and all that he'd done to build up our military. There isn't anybody for the next 10 or 20 or 30 years who's going to be president who's going to thank Barack Obama for what he's done to the U.S. military.
Let's lighten things up a little bit. You want to talk about Hillary?
That takes me a minute to shift gears.
I'll ask you a question.
No. All right, you ask me a question.
So Secretary Clinton has said that she's sorry that we're confused about her decision to use a personal server to conduct all of her business as Secretary of State. What's your assessment about how she could possibly have made that decision and the impact you think it's going to have on her presidential campaign.
Well, obviously I'm not a fan. I think she bears a lot of responsibility for some of the mistaken policies that have been followed and executed by this administration. Benghazi comes immediately to mind, where we lost 4 really good men. Shouldn't have happened that way, and she's going to have to go back one more time and testify before the Congress and explain it. On the server and email, when I was at the White House the last time around as vice president, I didn't do email. My grandkids would tell you it was because I was electronically ignorant. I did not understand what all that stuff was all about. But we were so sensitive, and it's hard for me to imagine that a woman as bright as Hillary Clinton is, that she would respond the same way. You're so sensitive to the fact that you're surrounded by everyday information, people talking about, writing about, highly classified information. It's part of the job. Before you go into a meeting in the West Wing Situation Room in the basement, there's a big basket there. And before you can go into the room for a meeting with the President and the National Security Council, you have to strip whatever electronic gear you've got off and throw in the basket. You got a pager, it goes in the basket. Got a cell phone, it goes in the basket. That was the rule when I was there, and of course I left January of '09. But it is without question, and it is beyond comprehension for me to figure out how she thought she could operate and deal with all of that really sensitive stuff and do it just with one server, and I don't know where it was in a closet in Denver or someplace. And I did not do email. Email wasn't as prominent in those days. And I had a computer on my desk that I had them take out eventually because I never used it. And I was sensitive as well too. I didn't write a lot of memos. From the time when I was Ford's chief of staff, you can go to the Ford Library today up in Ann Arbor, and you'll find a very thin file that's my file of the paper I generated while I was chief of staff. I had a staff that worked for me. I gave them a lot of verbal orders, but I also was in the habit of not wanting to leave a big paper trail, frankly. And but also, you operate under those circumstances. You're so sensitive that what you're dealing with is really sensitive information. It's beyond my comprehension how she could think that she was doing justice to the classification scheme, and apparently she wasn't. This week, I think they found at least 2 documents now that were part of her system that were top secret and should never have been put into that system.
Do you think that, given everything we now know, both about her performance as Secretary of State, about her inability to make a responsible judgment about handling classified material, that she's fit to be Commander-in-Chief?
I don't think so.
Now, I know that you're not going to endorse anybody tonight, but I have a different question. If the Republican presidential nominee asks you to head the Vice Presidential Search Committee, what will you say?
No. Well, first of all, I'd be in a lot of trouble with your mother.
I think that's good.
She wasn't sure that, I can remember the night I came home and told the family that sell the house. I told Lynn was there and our other daughter Mary, and I said, sell the house, I quit my job, we're going back into politics. And both daughter Mary and my wife Lynn did not think that was a very good idea. They kind of liked Dallas and all that I was involved in. Liz was immediately out in the garage painting yard signs, ready to go to war.
It worked out okay.
It worked out okay. So no, I'll do whatever I can to help the party. Obviously, my days in elective office are over. I had a fantastic career. I loved every minute of it. I'm also 74 years old, And the great news, good news is, as I told Liz, I've got a new heart, which means I'm going to live a lot longer. And now I'll live long enough to spend her inheritance.
Thinking about the next president and sort of how the transition process works, one of the things that I learned working on this book and on the memoir with you was the story about how you watched the transition from Ford to Carter. And most people that morning, January 20th, 1977, were watching Jimmy Carter put his hand on the Bible and raise his right hand and take the oath of office. What were you watching to symbolize the transfer of power that morning?
Well, one of the things that happens when you've got a new president elected, before he's sworn in, this is during the transition period, he gets briefed on all kinds of things. The outgoing administration sets up special briefings, things he's interested in or things he thinks he ought to know. There are special meetings between the presidents. And it's a time when, among other things, the new crowd coming in, but especially the new president, is briefed on the SIOP, the Single Integrated Operating Plan, the process and procedures you use to launch our strategic weapons. It involves, obviously, a military assistant who is with you 24/7, that carries the football that has in it the codes and the materials you'd use to do that. I always had one with me while I was vice president because I was next in the chain of command. But when you bring the new president in and you sit him down and you explain to him what all's involved, unless he's had a unique kind of experience before he gets there, it's highly classified. But he's told, among other things, you may have 20 minutes in which to make a decision about whether or not to use nuclear weapons. That's the kind of situation that you will live with 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, all that time that you're in that position. It's very sobering. It scares the heck out of most of them when they come in and get that brief. And I've watched it and worked it as Ford's chief of staff and then as Secretary of Defense or as vice president. And the thing about it that is in some ways most significant in terms of the real transfer of power takes place on January of '77. We still did the inaugurals on the east front of the Capitol, and I watched as Jimmy Carter took the oath of office. His military assistant reached out to Jerry Ford's military assistant, and Ford's assistant passed the football to Jimmy Carter, assistant, at high noon, at the exact moment that Carter took the oath of office. And at that moment, what's represented in that briefcase and that football is, in fact, obviously the reason why the president gets such a big salary and gets to live in a nice house. But he's got that responsibility with him 24/7 all the time he's there, and he doesn't get rid of it until the day it's passed on to his successor. So it's a sobering moment, even if you've spent some time on the problems and dealt with those issues and so forth. It really brings home in a very sort of intense way the responsibility you've accepted when you become president of the United States.
Given the gravity of the responsibility that's on the shoulders of the inhabitant of the Oval Office, one of the things that was frustrating working on this book and enraging in some ways was going back through and really piecing together all of the things President Obama and Secretary Clinton told us about al-Qaeda, about the threat from al-Qaeda, about the threat from ISIS, especially during the 2012 campaign. Talk about the difference between what they were saying and what we know to be true, and whether you think they lied to us.
Well,
It's not a softball.
No, it's not a softball. It is, without question, though, I think one of the most serious flaws in this administration. And the president has a view, or had a view, he still operates based on it, that he wanted to be able to say, that he could reallocate a lot of resources away from defense and spend it on domestic stuff. He didn't like the idea of having a major U.S. military presence in the Middle East. He wanted to get out of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan and so forth. That was his vision of what ought to happen. What the end result of that, or one of the results of it, was he had to have a narrative that he could tell the American people about the true state of affairs in the world in order to justify the policies he wanted to put in place. And the narrative was, for example, we got bin Laden, Al-Qaeda's dead, we don't have to worry about that anymore. That's why at the time of Benghazi, when we're in the middle of the campaign and the run-up to the 2012 election, you couldn't have a story immediately before the election that said an Al-Qaeda-backed group, after careful planning, launched an attack on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi and killed the ambassador and 3 others of our people. That had to be some other way that came about. So we got this whole story about the video, the offensive video that led to sort of a spontaneous eruption of anger and hostility. We had Michael Flynn, General Flynn, who was head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, who was reporting the truth. He was very much aware of what was happening out there in the world with respect to the terrorism problem. One of the studies was done by the Rand Corporation, contrary to what Barack Obama wanted us to believe and what he kept saying. The Rand Corporation came up with a study that showed that between 2010 and 2013, there had been a 58% increase in the number of terrorist groups around the world. We had a situation arise in the news just in the last 48 hours. Some of you may have picked up on it. A group of 50 analysts work in the intelligence community have gotten together and filed a complaint basically saying that their analytic work is being distorted or modified as it's passed up the chain of command. The suggestion being that, and I think it would take a lot to get 50 analysts to come together and in fact talk about that. And I think, in fact, I have every reason to believe it's true, but it also, again, reinforces this whole notion that Obama doesn't want to hear anything that's contrary to his basic worldview. So he either chooses to ignore it, or apparently in this case, you've got orders coming down from on top. Don't tell us about the explosion in terrorist organizations of the size of Al-Qaeda or the group called ISIS. Remember, he called ISIS, what was it, the JV of terrorism? It's very hard to justify what he's done. You begin to understand why he's made serious misjudgments, but it's also, I think it's a fundamental flaw in someone who would be commander-in-chief, not to tell the truth to the American people about the nature of the threat out there. That's how you get into a situation where instead of maintaining the military force we need to be secure, it goes right over people's heads. They're being told repeatedly, there's no problem, Al-Qaeda's dead, we got bin Laden, and you end up in a situation where this false narrative is peddled, and it's done so on a regular basis, and it raises major questions. And you especially know we've got problems when you get those folks out there in the field, and some of them in headquarters, but the analysts who see all the raw data, who've got to make judgments, prepare the president's daily brief, the PDB, that he receives first thing every morning. And that those analysts are convinced that their truth is not getting through or not being presented publicly to the country about how big the problem is. And they've now gone public with their dissatisfaction.
Let's talk about the Iran deal. You gave a speech we talked about a moment ago at AEI where you laid out the real difficulties with the deal. You have a situation now where the president is basically telling us it's the best he can do, where it looks like there are enough votes in the Senate that they may not even have a vote. It may be filibustered. What is your real sense of sort of where we are today, of the potential damage this deal will do? and the ramifications of the Senate deciding not even to put it up for a vote?
Well, it's sort of the crisis at the moment, but in my book, I've never seen anything like it in terms of what's happened here. The deal that has been put together by President Obama, John Kerry, and their team is, if that's good negotiating, I'm amazed. I've never seen an administration deal with arms control issues on that basis. If you look carefully at what they've done, they have not only set up a situation where Iran will be free to continue to work on improving their nuclear capability. The prohibitions against building a nuclear weapon don't come off for a few years yet, but the fact is they're already on record swearing not to build nuclear weapons. It's part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty they signed back in 1970 when 190 countries around the world signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and at the heart of that is a set of limitations now that this agreement that Obama's just negotiated lift. They, in effect, wipe away 6 UN Security Council resolutions, 5 of them authored by the United States, 3 of them approved unanimously over recent years that go directly at the Iranians and their nuclear program, and prohibitions on things like enrichment. And those resolutions have been repealed with a stroke of a pen when President Obama took that deal to the UN recently and got the plan adopted by the United Nations, which in effect took out those basic propositions. The problem is flawed. There's no meaningful inspection regime. They promised inspections anytime, anywhere. They said that's absolutely what we have to go forward. It's not in there. They dropped, Obama and company dropped that requirement. You've got an embargo. There's been an embargo on for some period of time now against doing business with the Iranians in the field of ballistic missiles. That's been dropped, and the limitation and prohibition on dealing in ballistic missiles is set to expire some 5 years down the road. Now, the only reason you want a ballistic missile is to put a warhead on it, and the Iranians, with the authority to be able to enrich uranium and build warheads on the one hand, and with ballistic missiles on the other, become the deadliest force in the Middle East, able to reach not only Europe but also the United States with a weapon. You've got a situation where the embargo that was on and has been on now for some time on non-nuclear weapons, conventional weapons, that's been lifted. Supposedly it's not going to go away for 5 years, but the guy who's the defense minister equivalent of the Iranians has said, we're not going to pay any attention to that. He's publicly said, we're going forward anyway. And the head of the Quds Force, General Soleimani, the worst of the worst, that's the toughest part of the IRGC, the Iranian Republican Guard. Soleimani sits, the deal has been signed, who's banned from travel. He's been in Moscow doing deals with Putin, and he's over there now acquiring the S-300. The S-300 is a very, very capable, very sophisticated anti-aircraft system. It's a big jump in Iranian capability if they can get that from the Russians. The Russians are eager to sell, so they're totally ignoring the agreement that they just signed and going forward with the acquisition of that capability. You think about Iran, you're thinking about the worst terror sponsoring state in the world, more deadly, more aggressive than anybody else. Prior to the events of 9/11, when Al-Qaeda came and hit us here in the United States, the Iranian-backed terrorist organizations had killed more Americans than anybody else, any other kind of terrorist organization. They're going to get $150 billion when the sanctions are lifted and the frozen assets go back to Iran. And so you, in effect, are setting up a situation where you're putting your friends and allies in the region in direct risk. I mean, this is a huge risk to Israel and to any of the other countries out there. But Israel, of course, is the target for Iran that they talk about all the time. They made it known repeatedly during the course of the negotiations that the destruction of Israel was not a subject they were willing to discuss, wouldn't have anything to do with it. Of course, they periodically hold rallies and holler death for America as a part of their regular routine. So we're taking this I think, worst adversary we've got on the face of the earth today, certainly one of them in Iran, and we are freeing them up on a path to building nuclear weapons. We're going to allow them to get ballistic missiles. We're going to allow them to get more sophisticated weapons and to provide them to others. We're going to provide a huge amount of cash that the Quds Force and others, their proxies, can use in Syria, can use in Iraq, can use in Yemen, in Lebanon, to support the Iranian-supported terrorist organizations in all of those states. They're going to become the dominant force in the Middle East, and they're a direct threat to our friends over there, all of whom are beside themselves. Liz and I were there just a year ago last spring. They can't believe what's happening, but it is happening. The Congress, a final point, Congress is supposed to vote on it. This should be treated as a treaty. It's not. Obama refused to consider it a treaty. He called it just an executive agreement, and he basically has the legal authority to do that. If it were a treaty, though, it would require a 2/3 vote of the United States Senate to ratify it. But as an executive agreement, he didn't have to submit it to the Congress at all. Congress tried to get a role for itself in the process, but what they came up with is sort of a kind of screwy system where, in effect, he has to submit the agreement, Congress can vote it down, then he gets to veto their motion voting it down, and unless they can override his veto, it goes into effect. So that's what the battle has been about until just recently, and now that they've got the votes, they now apparently have 42 Democrats in the Senate committed to support the president's position, then they can do a filibuster. You need 60 votes to be able to defeat the filibuster. They've only got 58 on the Republican side. Excuse me. So we're about to see a situation where one of the most important debates and issues that we're likely to have to deal with in certainly this decade, maybe longer than that, quarter of a century, isn't even going to happen because they'll filibuster, so there won't be a vote in the United States Senate on whether or not this is a good idea. That strikes me as an egregious, atrocious way for us to be doing our business. It ought to be treated as a treaty. It ought to be subjected to a vote. But they know they don't have the support of the American people. The polls show, maybe 20% actually supporting this agreement. They don't have the support of a majority of the Congress, either house. So it's sort of the icing on the cake, if you will, of Barack Obama's idea of defending the national security of the United States. It is an outrageous, egregious piece of work to help the Iranians, to boost their situation, to give them increasing amounts of money and a much better shot than they've ever had before at totally dominating the Middle East. And final point, remember, ballistic missiles and nuclear warheads, that makes us vulnerable to the wishes of the mullahs in Tehran.
It's yet one more example of how important elections are. And it seems very clear to me that as you're thinking about your own representatives, anybody who supported the deal or supported the filibuster ought to be held accountable the next time they're up, their name's on the ballot, because they're not doing their job, whether you agree with them or not, but they're not doing their job if they're not even willing to cast a vote. And this issue of elections brings me to where we are going to end tonight. It certainly was depressing some days for us, especially working on the second part of this book, which covers the Obama national security policy. But it's very important not to lose hope. And I want to leave you tonight with just an excerpt from the book, and then I'm going to ask my dad to read an excerpt as well about the difference we all can make and the duty that we have to make the difference. We have, as a nation, faced grave challenges before, and the right leaders have always brought us through. As Charles Krauthammer has observed, it is one of the enduring mysteries of American history, so near providential as to give the most hardened atheist pause, that it should have produced at every hinge point great men who matched the moment. A roiling revolutionary British colony gives birth to the greatest cohort of political thinkers ever. Jefferson, Adams, Madison, Hamilton, Washington, Franklin, and Jay. The crisis of the 19th century brings forth Lincoln, the 20th, FDR. We're living at another hinge point of history and require a president equal to this moment. Just as one president has left a path of destruction in his wake, one president can rescue us. We must choose wisely. And we have another duty as well that we want to leave you with this evening as Americans and as citizens.
As citizens, we also have a duty to protect our ideals and our freedom by safeguarding our history. We must ensure that our children know the truth about who we are, about what we've done, and why it is uniquely Americans' duty to be freedom's defender. Our children should know about the boys of Pointe du Hoc and Doolittle's Raiders, the battles of Midway and Iwo Jima. They should learn about the courage of the young Americans who fought the Nazis at the Battle of the Bulge and the Japanese on Okinawa. They should know why America was right to end the war by dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and about the fundamental decency of a nation that established the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They need to know about the horror of the Holocaust and what it means to promise never again. They should know that once there was an empire so evil and bereft of truth that it had to build a wall to keep its citizens in, and that the free world led by America defeated it. They need to know about the terrorists who attacked us on 9/11, the courage of the first responders, and the heroism of the passengers on United Flight 93. They should understand what kind of world militant Islam will create if we don't defeat it. They should learn about great men like George C. Marshall, Dwight Eisenhower, Harry Truman, Ronald Reagan. We must teach them what it took to prevail over evil in the 20th century and what it will take in the 21st. We must make sure they understand that it is the brave men and women of the United States Armed Forces who defend our freedom and secure it for millions of others as well. Our children need to know that they are citizens of the most powerful, good, and honorable nation in the history of mankind, the exceptional nation. Ordinary Americans have done heroic things to guarantee her survival. America's future and the future of freedom for all the world now depends on us. Speaking at Omaha Beach on the 40th anniversary of the D-Day landings, President Reagan put it this way: "We will always remember, we will always be proud, we will always be prepared, so we may always be free." Thank you.